Back in the app component, I now want to use my custom hook. And therefore, first of all, we have to import it. So I import use HTTP from hooks use HTTP. Then we can get rid of the isLoading and the error states, because that's now a state which will be managed by the custom hook. So we can just call use HTTP here. Let me actually call this here after initializing the tasks state. Now, the custom hook needs some arguments, because we expect two parameters here, the request config and a function that is applied to that data, which we get back. So, therefore, we should pass that in. And for the request config, we pass in an object with a URL property, because inside of the custom hook, we are accessing a URL property here. And we then also later access method headers and body. And therefore, for the URL in the app component, I will pass in this string here. Now, in the custom hook, we also then expect a method headers and body. And the thing is that for app.js, I just want to get data. And therefore, I want to send a GET request. I don't need any headers, and I don't need a body. And to be flexible enough and to not force all components to then pass in some dummy data or anything like that, I will go back to the custom hook and tweak this configuration here for the fetch request a bit. And in the case of the method here, check if request config method is set. And only if it is set, I apply it here. And otherwise, I set this to get as a default. For the headers, I will check if headers are provided on the request config. And if they are, I, of course, will apply them. Otherwise, I'll set headers to an empty object. And for the body, I'll check if request config body is set, in which case I will stringify it. So transform it to JSON, I mean. But if we got no body, I'll set this to null here. Now with that, the custom hook should be flexible enough so that use HTTP can just pass in an object that looks like this. Now that's not all though. We also need to provide a second argument, which is that function which receives the data here in the end. So therefore, I will define a function here. We could define it inline in the argument list, but to make it a bit more readable, I will define it here before I call use HTTP. And I will add a function which I'll name transform tasks. Here, I then expect to get my tasks object. And inside of transform tasks, I then want to apply the transformation logic which we had in use HTTP.js before. I deleted it there, but I still have it down here in app.js because I haven't deleted this code yet. So it's in the end this logic, lines 30 to 36 here in my case, which I want to copy and add here into transform tasks. And it's the tasks object for which I want to loop here with a for in loop, and which I use down there. And with that, we transform all the tasks from objects, which we get back from Firebase, into objects that have the structure and format we need for our frontend. And then we set our tasks state, which we can still do since we still have set tasks here. And we set our loaded task like this. And now it's the transform tasks function, a pointer at this function, which we pass as a second argument to use HTTP. And then this function will be called for us by the custom hook whenever we get a response. And this is the best of both worlds. With that, we have the main logic in the custom hook, but the data-specific logic in the component where we need the data. That alone still won't do the trick. Use HTTP does not just require parameters, it also returns something. It returns this object with the loading and error states and a pointer at the send request function, which we ultimately will need to call to trigger that request. So in app.js, I will get back my HTTP data here. You can name this constant however you want. And I will destructure it. by pointing at HTTP data, and we can pull out is loading, error, and send request. And of course, we can also do the destructuring right here and save that extra line. Now I will also assign an alias here, which is something we can do in JavaScript, by adding a colon here in this destructuring syntax and giving this a different name. And I will name it fetch tasks. So we're still pointing at the send request function from the custom hook. I'm just renaming it here inside of this component function. And with that, I will delete the old fetch tasks function in the app.js file. I will delete it like this, but I will keep useEffect here where I still call fetch tasks. Now here, however, I should add fetch tasks as a dependency now. We should have done this before, but before it wasn't really an issue because in the old fetch tasks function, I was only calling state updating functions, which are guaranteed by React to never change. And React noticed this and didn't warn me before. But React doesn't know this fetch tasks function, so this send request function at the end. It doesn't know what's going on in there, and therefore we have to add it as a dependency to rerun this effect whenever fetch tasks changes. At the moment, this would be a problem though, and therefore I will delete this dependency. We will re-add it later because this is not a good practice, but we will avoid this dependency for the moment because it would create an infinite loop right now, and we don't want that. And therefore with that, we now restructured the app component. We still get access to the isLoading and error states, which we pass on to tasks, to the tasks component down there. And we still get access to fetch tasks, but the logic for sending that request and handling errors and so on is now part of the custom hook. And therefore, if we save everything now, this should work again. And if I reload, it still loads all the tasks. And if I add a new task, that also still works. So that's now our custom hook being used. It isn't finished yet though, because as I mentioned, for example, here, we're not using it in a best practice way. Let's therefore do that in the next lecture.